It's true. Across the globe, women aren't as prosperous as men. Gender inequality is a pressing moral issue, but we forget it has massive economic implications. If you were to put all of the women who don't have access to formal financial services in one place, they would make up the third largest country in the world. That means an entire population without bank accounts, credit cards, or other tools you and I likely benefit from daily. Prosperity for women starts with inclusive policies, products, and people around the globe, and the investment to make it happen. Welcome to the Making Finance Work for Women podcast. My name is Sonia Kelly, and I lead Women's World Banking's proprietary research division. Join me as I speak with changemakers around the globe to deconstruct the social and economic exclusion women face. We'll discover new evidence together and drive action to accelerate women's economic empowerment. Because a leg up isn't a handout, it's a global game changer. Welcome and thank you so much for tuning in to the Making Finance Work for Women podcast, now streaming on YouTube and available wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sonia Kelly. If you're listening on YouTube, you'll be able to find additional insights and resources linked in the description of the video. Before we get started, I'd like to give a special shout out to the sponsor of the Making Finance Work for Women podcast, Ernst & Young LLP. EY is a global leader working across assurance, consulting, law, strategy, tax, and transactions. EY teams ask better questions to find new answers for the complex issues facing our world today. Visit their website at ey.com to explore their latest insights and services. Now let's jump into the show. Today we're talking about finance's heroine, consumer protection, which is an especially important topic in the digital age. Now, we know and we've talked at length about financial and products and services playing a crucial role in empowering women. Financial services help them to take control of their finances, improve their resilience. But with the fast pace of innovation and digitization, women and vulnerable groups with low digital literacy and low financial capability face increased risks. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Women tend to get lower quality services than men by nature of the fact that there are social norms. Take, for instance, a woman who doesn't have her own mobile phone, but instead has her own SIM card. Like it might be in her family a lower priority for her to get a mobile phone. And so she uses that SIM card and inserts it into the mobile phone of a family member and is only able to use her mobile phone sporadically. She then has less opportunity to engage with a personal digital device, and she has less opportunity to practice using digital financial services in a rapidly changing age. Digitization has made consumers vulnerable to online scams and fraud, and many consumers find that getting help is more difficult in the age of chatbot-based helplines. We also know changing products and technology make it difficult for policymakers to keep up. Some of these risks are amplified for low-income women and rural populations, which on average tend to have lower digital and financial capability. They have less awareness of their consumer rights, and they have a greater distrust in financial services or technology or complaint mechanisms. Women we know have unique financial preferences, many of which emerge from their specific challenges. There's a preference for privacy. With competing demands on their financial resources, women place a high value on the privacy of their services. There's also a preference for security. Women know they can only save a limited amount of funds at home without risk, and informal savings mechanisms can be unreliable. They need to be confident that their money held in a formal financial service will be there when they need it. And they have a value on control and trust. Women are expert money managers and they want control over their financial lives. Hidden fees and restrictions on account usage deter women's financial activity. If a product lacks consumer protection, women will be more likely to just stop using it. Fraud and online scams are also of major concern. There was a recent study in Cote d'Ivoire from an organization called CGAP, And the researchers who did this study found that women were more exposed to cyber risk than were men. And this was a national study. So we can be pretty confident of the results. In this study, women were more likely to lose money to scams. So 16% of women compared with 12% of men. They had more difficulty navigating the menu of financial services on their phones. So that's 25% of women had difficulty compared with 17% of men. And then they had trouble understanding financial products themselves that were delivered through mobile devices. And that was 22% of women compared with 18% of men. If I were to sum all this up, I would say we can group challenges into two categories. First, new risks related just to the advent of an increased use of digital financial services, like the need for assistance, lack of information, lack of transparency and costs, scam attempts, transaction errors, and other related challenges. And then, second, and perhaps diving into a specific issue, there are also these new challenges related to complaint collection and handling of complaints, given lower human engagement in the business models of digital financial services providers themselves. A few years ago, I asked the CEO of a digital credit provider in sub Saharan Africa about their consumer base. And this CEO said the consumer base was young urban men, which makes sense because they're the people who have a smartphone device. And this is the standard profile that we also see of DFS or digital financial services users around the world. My question is, if services are built with young urban men in mind, will they work for other populations like older rural women, for example? And what consumer protection mechanisms need to be in place as we build a world that's inclusive for everyone? Today, Women's World Banking is launching a consumer protection policy brief that includes 4 recommendations for policymakers, and I'm excited to dive into each of these with our esteemed guest. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Joanne Barefoot, CEO of Alliance for Innovative Regulation, or AIR. Welcome, Joanne. Let me give a quick summary of your bio before I turn to you. Joanne is the CEO and co-founder of AIR, which again is the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, excuse me. It's a nonprofit dedicated to digitizing the financial regulatory system to advance fair finance, to foster an innovative and resilient financial sector, and to combat financial crimes like human trafficking. A former deputy comptroller of the currency and staff member of the U.S. Senate Banking Committee, Joanne is a senior fellow emerita at the Harvard Kennedy School for Business and Government. So, a woman of many talents and a very diverse background. She hosts the global podcast show Barefoot Innovation and authored the seminal paper called A RegTech Manifesto, which we like at Women's World Banking. Joanne advises numerous regulatory bodies. She speaks annually to thousands of people throughout the world. And in 2020, she was inducted into the FinTech Hall of Fame by CB Insights. Welcome, Joanne. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, Joanne, we always like to start by asking our guest about their journey. So, for you, like what brought you into the financial inclusion space?
So let me say first how thrilled I am to be here. I'm such an admirer of women's world banking and all the work you're doing and the fact that sometimes we have the opportunity to work together. My journey began long ago. I've had a long career. And in fact, when I finished my college education and moved to Washington, D.C., it was at a time when it was still legal in the United States to discriminate on the basis of credit, on the basis of gender in credit. And in fact, it was widely viewed as a sound banking practice because the lender would say that a woman might get pregnant and therefore she should have her husband or co-father, her father co-sign a loan. So obviously, we've made a lot of progress since then. The laws have barred many practices that were discriminatory against both women and minority groups. But I spent my career then in Washington working for decades on how to advance consumer protection and financial inclusion through regulation. As you noted, I became a regulator. I was deputy controller of the currency. I was actually the first woman to be deputy controller of the currency. Um, and I think that these regulatory frameworks have achieved a lot, but I also reached a point in my career where I sort of took stock of how we were doing and reached the conclusion that we are not going to solve these problems through regulation alone. And this was also the time when we were suddenly beginning to see really innovative financial services evolving, mostly built around the mobile phone. And I realized that there was an opportunity to bring technology in to the same set of problem solving. And if you can do that and get the regulation right, you can, I think, make a much bigger impact on making financial services work better for more people.
Hmm. And that's where the Alliance for Innovative Regulation came in your career journey, it sounds like.
Exactly. I co-founded AIR 5 years ago. Actually, we just celebrated our fifth anniversary.
Happy
And
anniversary.
thank you. And we are a nonprofit based in the United States, but working globally on making the financial services world operate better for more people, more inclusive, more fair, more safe, more free of crime, as you mentioned. And we do that through a wide range of activities, including thought leadership and running tech sprint events and convening people across the silos, right? Getting people
Mm.
together out of their usual corners and working together to solve problems.
That's great. Well, I've really enjoyed working with your team on a personal note. Um, just thinking about the arc of your career, you've seen a lot of shifts, and as you said, the most recent shift is this shift towards digital financial services. Just, just very simply, do consumer protection laws and approaches need to change in this increasingly technology and digitally enabled world?
It's a great question, and my answer to that is they need to change profoundly. The laws and regulations that we have today reflect the limitations of the times in which they were mostly adopted. And those vary obviously across the world, but many of them have their roots dating back a half century to a time when information was much more difficult to obtain, whether you were a consumer or whether you were a lender and financial services company or whether you were a government body. And many of them are grounded in an assumption that the solution is to disclose information to consumers so that they can make good choices. And we have learned that that doesn't work very well, that people don't read government mandated disclosures and don't find them useful. And today we can do so much better because, and I know we'll talk about it as we go through our conversation, but there's so much opportunity to actually have more and better information throughout the ecosystem and really begin protecting people in a different way and doing that in a way that balances the need to protect people with the need to enable innovation that will continue through the private sector to continue to help people do better.
Yeah, I love that comment about the private sector role in this. So it's not just regulation, but also private sector. But it's something I struggle with as well because um, like we know that women have lower financial capability than men. You just mentioned like people are not going to read the disclosure form. Women are more likely to be illiterate. Women are more likely to say they need help opening an account, according to the Global Findex. Um, I've been in conversations with senior officials at multilaterals and standard setting bodies when I've seen them debate actually putting in consumer protection alongside of digital financial capability because they're worried that if they start bringing up digital financial capability, that it's going to it's going to be something that will allow providers to say, well, I can't really protect a financially incapable population. Like it's my client's fault that they can't read the disclosure form. It's my client's fault that they can't open an account. Like they should be able to do that. Other people do that. And so my question is coming to a question. Um, do you think focusing on digital financial capability as a policy goal puts an undue burden on consumers? Like, does that let financial services providers off the hook a bit when it comes to consumer protection?
Yeah, it's a profound question. Running through all of consumer financial protection over the decades has been this theme of how much should the government try to protect people from themselves? What if they make bad decisions and are harmed? Whose fault is that? And how tight should the access be if there are areas where we worry that people might become over indebted or might choose the wrong financial product or something like that? My point maybe for your audience today is that we should move toward designing a system that is so saturated with good information, good data, that we don't have to create these sort of archaic frameworks about who's to blame. And we should just have massive transparency and good tools for people. I realize this doesn't sound practical and realistic in the short term, but I think what we should be building toward are situations where consumers are using technology and data to make better choices and to protect themselves. And I believe we can do this through the use of artificial intelligence. Re, re, Set aside the challenges facing a woman who's illiterate. Just thinking about the average financial consumer, they almost never have enough information. You know, markets are supposed to optimize decision making by having a balance between the buyer and the seller. You know, they have equal information, they have equal bargaining power. And in financial services, that's almost never the case. These are very complicated products, and the consumer almost never has the same amount of insight into them that the provider does. And that's why they sometimes get loaded with hidden fees and complicated terms and so on that are profitable to the provider, whether the provider is putting them there on purpose or is just, it's just in the nature of what they're doing. The consumer often doesn't have the information to make a good choice. And I think the solution to that is better data. I think we should work toward a system in which the every consumer has this equivalent in some form of an AI agent that can help her know what she needs and know how to make a good choice and know how to manage her daily financial life. And I think that over time, we can make that an affordable thing for everyone. And I think that governments are going to need to focus on regulating that. If you have a situation where people are relying on an agent type helper, whether it's coming from the government or from the private sector or from the nonprofit sector, we would have to be sure that uh, that assistant was optimized for her best interest, not somebody else's. And if you did that, a lot of the problems we have would go away. You're not going to get there in 3 years or 5 years, but over 10 and 15 and 20 years, I think we can democratize the ability to really empower people with better tools for making decisions.
Okay, you went in a totally different direction than I thought you would, in the most interesting way, um, by saying like the consumer protection and financial capability challenges of today may be solved by technology tomorrow. And so the focus should be on thinking about the risks associated with that technology, not necessarily with dumb consumers today. That is just so fascinating.
I think that's a big part of it. I also think that there is a tremendous role for the government to play in better oversight of the industry. And it obviously needs to include a consumer protection dimension, and it too needs to be transformed through technology and data. I'm a former bank regulator, as you noted. Bank regulators, financial services regulators of all kinds are working with very small slivers of information about what is going on in these markets. And we need to equip them with more data and better technology too. Maybe we could circle back to this later. And they can do a better job than they do today of helping the provider meet its responsibility to make sure that they're not actively harming a customer. It is a tough balance, this question of whether, again, to protect the customer from herself. But we definitely could go in the right direction with better information and technology and some new models of consumer protection.
And now, a word from our sponsor. EY applauds Women's World Banking's 45-year legacy empowering women through financial inclusion. Together, we have a common vision to build a better financial services industry, one that is stronger, fairer, and more sustainable. Find out more on ey.com. Well, let's talk a little bit about data that regulators, policymakers, and supervisors have access to. I've seen such a range of data sophistication when it comes to the collection and use of sex or gender disaggregated data. Um, and I've seen some regulators and supervisors use that to say, look, there are gender imbalances in our financial system. I've seen others just unable to collect sex or gender disaggregated data in the first place. Women's World Banking often talks about the potential of using gender disaggregated data for monitoring discriminatory practices. Have you seen it happening? Like, do you have any standout examples or even principles for how it can happen in a way that benefits women consumers?
Yeah, Women's World Banking has been a really vocal advocate for the need for better data. As you know, the averages and median statistics that we see are masking tremendous disparities in what's actually happening on the ground. I think that some of the lack of uh, gender specific data comes from just the fact that it's a little more expensive and complicated to collect it. But I also think some of it has its roots long ago in the laws barring providers from collecting it. There was a concern that if the go back to what I was saying at the beginning, if the lender knows that the applicant is a woman, which might be obvious from the name, but might not be, or if the applicant is part of a minority group that the lender disfavors, then that might cause a negative decision. That is most of that problem. That is not the problem anymore. And the notion that we need these sort of gender blind uh, uh, inf- information sets in the hands of the decision makers, I think is just obsolete. So we should go overall to collecting the data and then having the financial provider use it, and also having the government and the NGOs use it. And I can't point to exemplars that I think are doing it wonderfully. They may exist and I'm not aware of it, but for the most part, I think we're at an early stage of moving in that direction.
Well, and like you said, I wrote it down here. Laws reflect the limitations of the times they were adopted. And that point about not wanting to collect gender disaggregated data is when I see in providers all the time saying, like, oh, we're not gender biased because we don't give gender information to our machine learning algorithm.
Yeah,
And so there's
exactly.
no way that it can be biased. when we know that there is, aside from there's names, which could could tip somebody off, or tip off the algorithm, but there's also lots of other data that falls along gender lines. I think my favorite example is GPS data. Women have greater unpaid care responsibilities and therefore spend more time at home. And if you're collecting GPS data, you can tell if it's a man or a woman on average.
Mhm.
So yeah, yeah.
The challenge of using AI, more data and AI to analyze it, uh, and the risk that it will both exacerbate bias and introduce new bias is huge. And I think it should be at the, one of the top goals of every private and public sector body that's trying to work on adopting AI. And I think the main solution to it is more information in the model, combined with holding these models accountable to, to challenging them to look for the potential of the bias coming in, and figuring out how to optimize them in other ways.
Mm. Yeah, and regulators having the skill to do that, to monitor the
Yes.
algorithm. That's a whole whole 'nother conversation. Maybe that's another podcast for us.
Well, it is, but let me say this is one of the main things that AIR works on is helping the regulators themselves modernize. They need better data. They need better technology. They need new talent. They need different cultures. We actually are putting out a white paper in the next few weeks on this challenge, the regulators' journey, and we'll be putting out a series of tools to help regulators make this shift. Because if the regulator stays in the tech world of, you name it, 1990 or earlier, or 2005, we're not going to get where we need to get in modernizing financial markets.
Mm. Yeah. Um, I've heard, and you've probably heard as well, a lot of discussion about digital public infrastructure lately, including connectivity, digital identity, data storage, and other initiatives. I love these conversations because they're bringing together different groups that previously weren't talking to each other. But how should these conversations about digital public infrastructure incorporate consumer protection? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, first, let me just say that these conversations are so important. And to the extent that you may have um, the listener group, including philanthropic organizations and funders, uh, we need more people investing in infrastructure in the financial world. The Sometimes that's the hardest thing to work on, because it's not as fun and interesting as sort of the activities that are closer to the outcome. You have to trust in the need to invest in the enabling technologies and so on. But if you don't do that, you're not going to get the outcomes that you want. Um, and I I do think it needs to be all designed mindfully of consumer protection. And again, at the risk of repeating myself, I think the key to that is enabling the data and data analysis at every step of the way. If we ask ourselves, what do consumers need from financial services providers? They need access uh, to the delivery system, the type of phone, the broadband or whatever, and to the products. They need protection from bias. They need protection from deception or complexity that makes it hard for them to make a good decision. So they need transparency. They also, it's not usually classified as consumer protection, but uh, a part of this is to protect people from the crime, which is also disproportionately committed against women. If we think about crimes like human trafficking, and as you already noted, the scams that prey upon people, um, we have women all over the world who are entrapped in situations, and the government isn't very well equipped to protect them because it doesn't have the insight into what's going on. So all of those factors need to be built into infrastructure development. Um, and again, the first question to ask in every case is what's the information we need to be sure that we are protecting people who are using this system?
Mm. Well, Joanne, our time is almost over, but I want to ask one more question, which is to bring it back to you and your story. Your story is a pretty fascinating one because you started as a senior bank regulator and you've stayed in the financial services space, but moved into this financial inclusion space. But you're also in your personal life not afraid of taking risks. And I found this through an internet search. So it's public information. You've searched for wolves in the Arctic. You've been charged by a brown bear in Alaska. You've spent 4 days and 3 nights on a mountain solo with no tent fasting. I mean, I see these are not things I would expect in a financial sector regulator, and the way I interpret that and sort of bring it back to our conversation is you've really balanced um, this push for or space for taking risks and innovating with a career that is typically quite predictable um, and has a defined trajectory. And so in your own life, I see you having balanced principles of stability against innovation and risk, and found a way to do it that makes you an innovator in this regulatory space. So given your expertise, bringing it back to our conversation, what would your advice be to somebody who's trying to find harmony between the need for oversight and strong consumer protection, and also the drive for innovation and the need to create spaces for innovation?
I appreciate the question. I think a lot of my advice in this is, and I touched on it earlier, that people need to get out of their silos, especially as the world accelerates and is changing faster. You know, that you can't keep up unless you're doing if you're working across a wide spectrum of things. And I'm a great believer that those of us who are mostly doing like left brain work, which is what most regulatory topics are and financial topics are, bring your right brain into it, be creative, spend time doing things that are different because that's where the insights will suddenly light up. You just realize something if you get away from your day to day, and really think differently about it. And I also really do advise people to be bold and be brave. And frankly, women, especially if we're talking about women who are trying to really change the world for other women and other people, the key to it really is to take some risk and to reach high. And I like to say to people, even if you fail, it's very unlikely to hurt you. You'll still probably end up better off than you would have if you hadn't tried. And if you succeed, you can change the world, I mean, you can't make it perfect. We know that. But you can really make things different. There's a song lyric I like to cite from a song called Let Your Heart Hold Fast by Ford Atlantic. And the line is never fear. And I sort of use that as my motto. So again, the work that Women's World Banking is doing is so important. And I just can't encourage people enough to support it and follow that journey.
Thanks so much, Joanne. Yeah, the feeling is mutual. The work that you're doing is so important, and we're so grateful for you sharing with us today. Thanks so much.
I'm delighted to be here.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. I have a few notes here, but one that I noted down is that one that Joanne said at the beginning, that laws reflect the limitations of the times they were adopted. And the other one is um, it's just like a very simple list. We have a lot of ways of talking about consumer protection needs, but I like Joanne's list when she was talking about digital public infrastructure and the need to build in consumer protection there. She said people need access to channels, people need protection from bias, they need protection from complexity or fraud, and they need protection from crime. And I just thought that was like a very simple way of describing consumer protection principles. I mentioned at the beginning, Women's World Banking is launching today our consumer protection policy brief. So we'll put the link to for that in the chat of the YouTube page. I'd love for you to check it out. You can just Google it if you want to. Women's World Banking Consumer Protection Policy Brief. I'd also encourage you to check out the AIR website. That address is regulationinnovation.org, and specifically, they have some very cool AI work that they've put out recently that I would encourage you to take a look at. It has strong overlap with financial consumer protection and dives into detail in some of the things that Joanne was talking about with risks of AI, but also like the use of AI and the opportunity for AI to benefit our work. Finally, I would encourage you to check out the Women in Inclusive Tech Regulation Program. This is a joint AIR Women's World Banking venture that we're moving forward with. We're inviting regulators, policymakers, and supervisors who need the technology inside track to grow and advance in their careers. We're inviting them to come together from across the world to explore inclusive tech regulation. And it's going to be a fantastic program this year. So I'd encourage you to look that up, get on the mailing list, and consider signing up for it. We'd love to connect with you on that. Thank you so much for joining us at the Making Finance Work for Women podcast. Again, I'm Sonia Kelly, and I'm so glad you listened today. We'll catch you next time on the third Thursday of the month.